Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the J. I'm Henriette. I'm the Adult Programming Director. I'm very proud to be here and to take part in this amazing upcoming presentation. I would like to introduce you to Chava Tiro Samuelson, Director of Jewish Studies at ASU, and Lisa Kaplan, Assistant Director at Jewish Studies ASU. I hope you have a wonderful evening and give you the word.
So, welcome everyone here in person and everyone online. And this is the second lecture of the Albert and Lisa Scholar in Residence lectures, which we do actually once a year. So it's an annual event. We had the morning lecture at ASU, and I understand that some people in the audience were there. Who was in the morning lecture? Yeah, one. Oh, good for you. This is great. Wonderful. So you attended it online in the morning. So you're going to hear some of the same thing I said in the morning. But I want to start by thanking the staff and the leadership of JCC for hosting this program here and for collaborating with us, ASU Jewish Studies. Just last month, I gave 3 lectures here, actually in this very room, about modern Jewish philosophy. So we discussed Buber, and then Soloveitchik, and then Kaplan. It was really, really very enriching experience for all of us, myself included. And what it shows is that our commitment to learning as a lifelong experience. I also want to thank Lisa Kaplan, the Assistant Director of Jewish Studies, for making all the logistical arrangements with this institution, with our speaker, Professor Myers, and for doing everything else for Jewish Studies. I additionally would like to thank Kirsten K. Edgett, our communication person, who created the publicity for this event, and to Ari Gajraj, who's sitting in the back, and he is our tech person, and without him, this hybrid event could not have succeeded. So thank you all. So many of you know me. I'm Chavati Rose Samuelson. I'm Regents Professor at ASU. I'm Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism. And I'm the Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. We do offer BA courses in Jewish Studies in case your children or grandchildren are interested in that. You can also do graduate degrees through history or through religious studies or through philosophy at ASU. And mainly we offer events like this, namely public lectures, we have seminars, we have conferences, we have exhibits, we have even musical performances, and all of this to showcase the richness of the Jewish tradition. And what has enabled us to do all that is the generosity of the people in Phoenix, and especially the extended Eckstein family. So the Eckstein Scholar in Residence, it's a rather old program, and I know I always get the dates wrong, but Paul or John can probably tell me exactly when it started, but I believe sometime in the 1980s. Just 1988? 89. All right, here you go. Oh, all right. That's a traumatic thing. So I left it vaguely enough to say in the 80s, this program started, and that program really enabled us to bring best Judaica scholars to Phoenix, to ASU, to enrich the learning that is going on at ASU and beyond the community of the university. So the Eckstein family established this particular program to commemorate the contribution to Jewish life of their parents, Dr. Albert Eckstein and Lisa Eckstein, his wife. And I have to say, it's wonderful to see a multi-generational development because the children of Albert and Lisa, John and Paul, 2 brothers, married 2 sisters, as many of you know, and that's Flo and Diane. And I got is the last name correct? Newmark, right? All right. So we have the Ecksteins and the Newmark together. There's an larger kind of constellation of the Eckstein family More people are involved in it, but it's wonderful to see the contribution that they have made to a lot of philanthropic activities, to a lot of initiatives in Phoenix, Arizona. So the Eckstein Scholar in Residence program is just one example, and it brought us in contact with scholars who study Jewish history, the Jewish religion, culture, sociology, politics, literature, art. We try to do all of the above, and that's to show you the inherently interdisciplinary nature of Jewish studies. So on behalf of ASC, I would like to thank all of you in the Eckstein family and invite Tim to, this is now third generation, right, to say something on behalf of the Eckstein family.
Welcome on behalf of my grandparents, Albert and Lisa, my parents, Paul and Flo, and my aunt and uncle, John and Diane, and the extended family. Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you, David, for coming out, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your remarks. So I'm thinking about the topic, shifting attitudes towards Israel. I think it was described as generational and ideological movements over decades, the impact of October 7th on that and what that portends for the future. Obviously, all of our experiences are very much sort of impactful upon our views because that's how human beings function. And I thought about my grandparents and their relationships and their views toward Israel, obviously of a generation that is older than anyone here in this room, but how that may shed some light or at least raise some questions about people's attitudes today. So they were both born in Europe in 1908. My grandfather was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. My grandmother was born in Frankfurt, Germany. After World War I, the place where my grandfather was born in Transylvania moved from controlled by the Hungarians to the Romanians. And the Romanians were worse to the Jews than the Hungarians. So he had that experience as a child. He was involved in a Zionist scout group. And that combination of things, I think, led him to be very much a Zionist from a young age. My grandmother was born to a more well-to-do family in Frankfurt, Germany, didn't experience the upfront anti-Semitism that my grandfather experienced on a pretty regular basis. But the time in which they were born was a time of sort of shifting attitudes towards Zionism. In fact, the sort of modern conception of Zionism wasn't much older than my grandparents. Herzl reported on the Dreyfus Affair in the early 1890s. The first World Zionist Congress, I think, was 1896 or 1897, something like that. Dreyfus himself was exonerated in 1906, which would have been 2 years before my grandparents were born. That's the world they were born into. My grandfather, because of the anti-Semitism in Romania, his family emigrated to the United States in 1926. And then he experienced anti-Semitism in the United States. He was not admitted into medical school here in the US because of the Jewish quotas. And so ironically, the place where he was able to get into medical school was Frankfurt, Germany, where he went and met my grandmother and they married. But of course, he started medical school in 1931. And he was there until 1936 when they left. And Germany obviously was not a great place for the Jews during that period of time. The Nuremberg laws had passed in 1935, but before that, he and my grandmother were facing an increasing amount of anti-Semitism, and they were sort of fortunate to get out when they did. Those experiences left sort of an indelible impact on them. So when the State of Israel was founded in 1948, there was never any doubt, I think, for either of them of the import of that. So both on a very personal, visceral level for their experiences, and then, of course, what they knew had happened in terms of the Holocaust. For my grandfather, most of his mother's family back in Hungary and Romania was killed in Auschwitz. My grandmother's uncle and his wife were on the St. Louis ship that was not allowed to dock here in the United States in 1939. They also perished in Auschwitz. So there was never any question, I think, for them about the real import, because they had experienced anti-Semitism sort of, again, both personally and then on a global level in a way that most of us have not, certainly those born after 1945. And I was born in 1970. I obviously had no experiences like that. As an adult, coming into my adulthood in the 1990s, it was the time where historians, Francis Fukuyama had called it the end of history. This idea that we had sort of moved to a place where historical events had kind of stopped happening. The Western liberal order had taken a hold, and life for human beings was going to be very different. And that changed obviously substantially in 2001. Things have been, from a global geopolitical place, different since then, but I don't know that they've been that meaningfully different for Jews. I'm just speaking subjectively now, really until October 7th of 2023. And I'm not an Israeli. I lived there for 1 year, but that was a long time ago. I'm 5,000 miles away, as we all are. But the impact of that day and the experience of still having hostages kept to this very day and unlikely to sort of be released anytime in the near future, it weighs heavily on me, and I know it has an impact on my subjective shifting views toward Israel. So I'll sort of posit this question as I wrap up here for David, but whether, and I know the sort of macro theory of Jews' views towards Israel is that the younger the Jewish generation, the less likely they are to feel connected to Israel, and whether October 7th has served as sort of a driver in both directions for those younger views of Jews' views of Israel. For some Jews, viewing Israel's conduct and behavior towards the Palestinian people and then internally within Israel has made people feel more distant, and whether Jews in America, because of the experiences that we've had post-October 7th, feeling isolated, alienated, understood, where people just care very little for Jewish lives, whether that has caused younger Jews to have a stronger connection toward Israel. I look forward to hearing David's talk, and thank you all for coming.
Well, that was a perfect setup for the talk. So let me tell you a little bit about Professor Myers. He is Distinguished Professor and Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA. He, quite remarkably, I should say, has held a number of administrative position, and how he managed to do all that and publish as much as I'm going to tell you that he published, it's quite amazing. So has been the director of the Luskin Center for History and Policy. He's the director of the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate. He's the director of the UCLA Bedari Kindness Institute. I really would love to know more about that institute. We need it all. And he has been the chair of the UCLA History Department for 5 years, 2010 to 2015, and director of the Center for Jewish Studies, which has done a total of 10 years. So he's done all that while publishing very, very prolifically. He holds a BA from Yale University. He has 2 MA, continued to do MA level work, both in Tel Aviv University and then at Harvard University, and completed his PhD at Columbia University in 1991. What's amazing about the connection between what Tim just said and what you're going to hear tonight is that nobody else could have done this connection between German Jewry and Zionism and perceptions of history and how does it all fit together than Professor Meyer. So you're going to hear all of that. Here are some books that you may want to look up on Amazon and see maybe something will spark your interest. I would suggest that you start with the book Resisting History, Historicism and Its Discontents. Obviously, you can hear the reference to Freud in the title. Historicism and Its Discontents in German Jewish Thought. That's a book, Princeton University Press, 2003. He has another book, which also is very relevant to the talk tonight, Between Jews and Arabs, The Lost Voice of Simon Rabidowicz, a very interesting Polish Jew who was an historian, ended up in England, find his way to the United States, taught both in Chicago and in Brandeis. And many of the ideas, correct me, David, if I'm wrong, many of his political ideas actually kind of inform the way you understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He has also written books on contemporary Haredi society in America. He has one book with his wife, who is a professor of law at UCLA. Her name is Naomi Stolzenberg, and the title of the book is American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Yoel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York. That book was published in 2022 and received the National Jewish Book Award in American Jewish Studies. So he's been very prolific, and nobody really can do a better job trying to figure out the complex relationship between Israel and the United States in terms of American Jewry, at least, after October 7th. So please welcome Professor Myers to Phoenix and, of course, to ASU. So, David, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. I want to begin by thanking my friend and what she neglected to add, teacher, Professor Chavatiro Samuelson, whom I encountered a number of years ago. I won't actually name the figure. 40 years ago, 40, Chava, in a seminar on medieval and early modern Jewish intellectual history, which was a really powerful, even transformative intellectual experience for me. It's really wonderful to be back here and to talk, as we've had an opportunity to do, and reconnect. I also want to reiterate my thanks to Lisa for all the work that she has done in making this possible, to the Center for Jewish Studies, and above all to the Eckstein family, whom I've just had such a delightful time getting to know last night and a little bit tonight. Tim, you've framed the question. You've set it up. It can only go downhill from here, I'm afraid. You'd set it up so perfectly. I also should take note of the fact that it seems like this is the 36th lecture or yearly occurrence of the Eckstein Skull and Resonance Program, which is a figure that has significant resonance and a positive value in the Jewish tradition, 2 times high. So with that omen, let us jump right in. What I want to talk to you about is connected to what Tim said, which is the emergence of what would seem to be a consensus amongst American Jews toward Zionism and Israel. And I would frame it this way, in the ways that the sociologist Robert Bellah famously framed things in the United States, that Zionism and even sort of a sense of allegiance, not in the ultimate political sense, but a sense of deep commitment to the state of Israel, assume the status of what we might call civil or civic religion. It's a term that extends back to the late 18th century philosopher Rousseau, whom I mentioned earlier today in a different context, by which we mean it achieved a status of a kind of iconic status, a status of to which great valor and reverence were attached, even though it wasn't a religion in a traditional sense. I'm talking about Zionism and reverence for Israel amongst American Jews. And so what we want to trace over the course of the night is the emergence of that position, because it was by no means self-evident that that would be the case in the 19th century. But at the same time, we want to follow a countervailing current, which is to say that as we see the ascent of Zionism and a connection to the state of Israel to the status of a civil religion for American Jews, there has always been contention and a very serious disagreement over Zionism amongst American Jews. And these two currents are simultaneous and concurrent, and in some sense provide the necessary friction to allow for the generation of new perspectives. So the way we're going to approach this is in the following fashion. And we want to talk about 4 stages in the shifting attitudes. The first stage I call the Age of Americanization, that extends from 1885 to 1948. The second stage is the stage that I've rather felicitously entitled with a title that just rolls off the tongue, The Age of Integration and Institutionalization, extending from 48 to 67. 1967, 2005, The Age of Elation, for reasons that I will describe. And then finally, we'll talk about the age of fragmentation that we have seen over the last 20 years or so. Tim mentioned the impact of October 7th, that devastating, horrifying day, which is one of the darkest days in the modern Jewish experience. And one might assume that in its wake, there would be a refortification of the consensual position that had emerged over the previous half century or so. I would suggest that that has not been the case. So this is in part an answer to one of the questions that Tim was posing for reasons that we're going to explore. And what I want to say is that that fragmentation that we see is indeed deeply rooted historically. That in fact there has been both an emerging consolidation of opinion around Israel, but at various points in time, that process of consolidation has been subject to very serious critique that chipped away at that position of Zionism in Israel as a civil religion. Just to begin to set the stage, this is a demographic analysis from 3 years ago or so, which shows that the world Jewish population is overwhelmingly dominated by two centers, Israel and the United States. And those two centers are, depending on one's demographic prediction, almost co-equal in size, somewhere between 6.5 and 7 million Jews in each of those settings. So there's a state of relative demographic parity. That is new because at the end of the Second World War, I believe it was 94% of the world's Jewish population lived outside of the state of Israel. And this is important to note because of the rising significance of Israel in not just the global Jewish imagination, but really in global Jewish life. Israel is occupying a much larger piece of the puzzle, of the pie. And that has an impact on its growing salience in the worldview of Jews both inside and outside Israel. Okay, Chava mentioned that I wrote a book about a man named Simon or Shimon Ravidovich. He was one of the most interesting and iconoclastic Jewish thinkers of the 20th century. A number of his volumes are available in English, should you be interested. I'm not going to give an extended discourse on Ravidovich's thinking, but he is renowned for having written an article in 1949 called Israel, the Ever-Dying People, in which he made the point that in every generation, there are many who assume that this generation will be the last link in the chain, generation after generation. So there's a kind of, as my teachers would say, lachrymose perspective on Jewish history, a mournful or tearful perspective in which one believes that this generation will be the last over and over and over again. And I would suggest to you that that fear of being the last link in the chain has an ironic effect of reinvigorating and revitalizing. The anxiety of being the last actually induces a degree of new energy. You might ask, how healthy is it for anxiety to play that role? Is there something that a psychologist or even pathologist might say about that? And I'll leave that for another conversation. But nonetheless, we once again face that question. Are we the last link in the chain? Have we achieved or degenerated in the post-October 7th world into a new state of fragmentation from which we will not recover? A recurrent question, I reiterate. So let's jump into the first phase, which I would begin. I could have begun it in 1897, the first Zionist Congress, as Tim mentioned, but I'm going to start it in 1885, which was the year in which a group of Reform rabbis led by perhaps the most prominent Reform rabbi of the time, Isaac Mayer Wise, the founder of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, convened in Pittsburgh, which has connections to the Eckstein family, to devise a kind of ideological platform for Reform Judaism in America. Reform Judaism, as you perhaps know, took rise first in Germany and then was transported to the United States by figures like Isaac Mayer Wise. And one of the tasks of this gathering was to lay out some of the fundamental ideological precepts of Reform Judaism in America. And it's very significant to note what we see in the section in yellow, which is the declaration of this group of Reform rabbis that we consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. But this is a formulation that occurs 12 years before the First Zionist Congress, 11 years before Herzl's The Jewish State, his kind of programmatic manifesto calling for the creation of a state for the Jews, but nonetheless signaling the concern of Reform rabbis that nationalism was creeping into the Jewish ethos. And they wanted to make very clear, we and nationalism have nothing in common. We are Jews as a matter of religion, as a matter of religious identity. And that religious identity, by the way, can be performed in the privacy of our own homes or in the discrete confines of a synagogue. We are Americans by national or civic identity. That declaration was simultaneous with the first organizational efforts of what would become the Zionist movement. So we have a Zionism, as the French would say, avant la lettre, before there was actually Zionism, before the term was actually developed. And that movement takes rise in Tsarist Russia in the wake of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, which itself prompted a series of violent pogroms against Jews, which led to a very significant migratory stream. The most statistically significant of those migratory streams made its way to the United States. Over 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe made their way to the United States. But another significant migratory stream, not so much in statistical terms, but in overall historical terms, was that which operated under the banner of the Love of Zion movement. So the term Zion enters into Jewish historical consciousness anew in the wake of the convulsive pogroms of 1882, and we have a movement born called Chibat Zion, right around the time as the Pittsburgh Platform. So if we could just go back for a minute to the kind of one of the organizing principles of the talk, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. We should not assume there was unanimity amongst Jews about even how they define themselves. Chibat Zion, led by a Russian Jewish doctor by the name of Leo Pinsker, who wrote an important pamphlet in 1882 called Auto-Emancipation. Jews shouldn't wait for others to emancipate themselves. Jews should emancipate themselves. And they should do so because everywhere they are strangers and needed a home of their own. So very different ethos than that of Isaac Mayer Wise and the Reformers. So we have a sense of difference, really, from very stark divergence of perspectives from the late 19th century. That said, we know that Zionism began to make its way to the United States. It wasn't altogether foreign to the United States. It wasn't as if the Reform Jews of the Pittsburgh Platform dominated all of the action in the United States. Perhaps the most renowned American Zionist in the first half of the 20th century was himself a descendant of a distinguished German Jewish family with Reform roots, Justice Louis Brandeis, who offered the following quite famous formulation in which he said, to be good Americans, we must be better Jews, and to be better Jews, we must become Zionists. And in that regard, he kind of exploded the logic of the Pittsburgh Platform, which said, either you're a nationalist or you're Jew by religion. Here, in syllogistic fashion, Brandeis is trying to bring together these three elements of Americanness, Jewishness, and Zionism, and argue that they were, in fact, seamlessly integrated into one. And it's interesting to know that although Zionism began its life in the late 19th century as a minority movement within the Jewish world, certainly within the largest concentration of Jews in the world in Eastern Europe, it began to grow decade by decade, including in the United States, such that by 1917, as you see, there were 200,000 shekel-paying members of the American Zionist movement. And that occasioned a rethinking on the part of Reform rabbis who held another convention in the city of Columbus, Ohio, in 1937. So let's see, that's 52 years after Pittsburgh, in which they articulated a new vision of their own sense of identity and relation to Zionism. So they said, first, in all lands where our people live, they assume and seek to share loyally the full duties and responsibilities of citizenship and to create seats of Jewish knowledge and religion. So this was really an affirmation of the fundamental Americanness of American Jews. We are loyal to the United States as a matter of political allegiance. But they also said, quite in contrast to the language of the Pittsburgh Platform, in the rehabilitation of Palestine, the land hallowed by memories and hopes, we behold the promise of renewed life for many of our brethren. We affirm the obligation of all Jewry to aid in its upbuilding as a Jewish homeland. So we see here, in a certain sense, an act of koshering, rendering kosher, that developing movement that came to be known as Zionism by Reform rabbis. Although you'll notice that they thought it relevant for many of our brethren, not really themselves. And this was a very common feature of German Zionism as it takes rise in the first decades of the 20th century, which is to say, this is good for Eastern European Jews, but we here in Germany don't really need Zionism for ourselves. We'll support the movement, but for others. So that sensibility is reflected in the Columbus Platform, and it would seem to suggest that there was kind of an emerging consensus amongst American Jews. But what I want to ask you to do is don't jump to hasty conclusions, because just when one assumes that things are beginning to consolidate, a countervailing movement takes rise. And in fact, there were several. The first of note was an organization populated by Reform rabbis, Reform Jews, and particularly rabbis amongst them. In 1942, 5 years after the Columbus Platform, called the American Council for Judaism. The American Council for Judaism, I want to be very, very clear, was not led by the person on your right. I'm going to talk about him in a minute. Okay, so try and keep them separate. If I were better at PowerPoint, I'd be able to make the distinction clear. The American Council for Judaism, as you can see, on the left side, makes clear again what we saw in that first part of the Columbus Platform, the Americanness of Jews in the United States, and on the right part makes clear its very sharp anti-nationalism. Its very strong opposition to Zionism and the idea of strong national ties to Israel. And this became an important pillar of opposition to Zionism as it was growing in a particularly dangerous time for European Jewry. And we're talking about 1942, so this is 9 years after the rise to power of Adolf Hitler, 3 years after the entry of Nazi Germany, and 3 years after the commencement of the Second World War and the entry of Nazi Germany into Poland, which was, together with Russia, the largest concentration of Jews in the world, and at a time when the clouds over Europe darkened very considerably for its Jewish population. The American Council for Judaism, though, wanted to make the case that this is not how we define ourselves. We are first and foremost Americans. We are first and foremost Jews by virtue of our religion. And that was, ironically enough, a position held by, the latter position at least, held by the person on your right. His name is Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum. He was the founding rabbi of the Satmar Hasidic dynasty, which in fact is the largest Hasidic group in the world today. And he is perhaps the most significant Jewish anti-Zionist of the 20th century. He opposed Zionism not so much because of his commitment to Americanism, but because he saw Zionism as a kind of arrogation of divine responsibility to human beings. He felt Zionists were essentially taking on the divine prerogative to hasten the messianic end by themselves. And this was an absolute profanation of God's name and a transgression of the gravest order. In fact, he went on to call in his 1959-1960 book, Vayel Moshe, he went on to call Zionism the greatest form of spiritual pollution the world has ever seen. And he attracted tens of thousands, and now there are hundreds of thousands of Satmar Hasidim, which is to say there are two strands of anti-Zionism that take rise in the 1940s. Teitelbaum's anti-Zionism takes rise earlier. Teitelbaum arrives to the United States in 1946, thereby lending new power to Hasidic or Haredi anti-Zionism. But you can see these two quite diverse and yet potent pillars of anti-Zionism taking rise just as we thought there was a new consensus. But the current is a very meandering one. There's not a straight line. And this is part of what I want to convey to you. There's a kind of moment of consolidation, which is then shattered. And then we see sort of an attempt to reconstitute that consensual position. In the same year that the American Council for Judaism was established, as the threat faced by European Jews was growing graver by the hour. Indeed, it's in late 1941 that we have the first significant experiments in mass extermination taking place. And it's in 1942 that we hear reports making their way out from Europe of the attempted extermination of European Jewry. It's in that context that a group of Zionists in the United States and elsewhere, as well as others who previously had not defined themselves as Zionists, gathered at the Biltmore Hotel in New York for what is known as the Biltmore Conference, when these various groups decided to call at that very meeting for the creation of what they called a Jewish Commonwealth, meaning a Jewish state, sort of to profess in very clear terms that what was needed was not just a place of refuge for Jews in the land of Israel, but political sovereignty. And that conference brought together some unlikely ideological bedfellows and reflected what would seem to be a growing sense within the American Jewish community of the urgency of the hour. But again, keep in mind that as this is taking place, we also have these other expressions on the left and the right of the religious or denominational spectrum. Momentum toward the creation of a Jewish state continues throughout the 1940s in the United States, certainly in Palestine, amongst the Jewish community of what was known as the Yishuv, and at the newly created United Nations after 1945, where a great deal of diplomatic effort is made by Zionists to convince the General Assembly of the United Nations to approve of the report that had been issued by the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine that took rise in 1947 after the British announced that they were going to bring an end to the mandate that they possessed that had been granted to them by the League of Nations between 1920 and 1922. British announced, we're pulling out of Palestine. We're not going to be responsible. The newly created United Nations came in and said, okay, we'll send a team to investigate conditions on the ground. And that committee quite famously recommended the partition of Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. That's what the United Nations General Assembly voted on November 29th, 1947, and it was approved. We, at this point, moved to phase 2 of our journey, which will be quicker than phase 1, I promise you. What I call the age of integration and institutionalization. And here we see, again, kind of countervailing impulses over this 19-year period. On one hand, we see the affirmation by the United States of the need for a Jewish state. Here you see on the left a picture of President Harry Truman and the first president of the state of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, reflecting the commitment of the United States to the creation and well-being of the state of Israel in its early years. But we also should take note of that ongoing impulse on the part of American Jews, the American Jewish rank and file, to integrate into the United States, to become American in the full sense. And you know, one of the most comic and in some sense tragic articulations of that impulse comes in the writing of the great American Jewish author Philip Roth in Goodbye Columbus, and more substantially later in his unforgettable counterfactual novel, The Plot Against America, where one sees this the desperation of the impulse to integrate into America. So just as the state of Israel is created, we see also this very strong impulse to integrate into the United States, lending the sense, as Brandeis said, that an ongoing commitment to Zionism and a sort of an ongoing commitment to an Americanism were not necessarily mutually exclusive. This question of Zionism and Americanism stood at the center of a very interesting negotiation that took place between the founding figure of the Israeli state, David Ben-Gurion, and the president of the American Jewish Committee, a man by the name of Jacob Blaustein, a very prominent American Jewish philanthropist. The American Jewish Committee defined itself formally in this period as non-Zionist, which meant that it did not embrace the ideology of Zionism that said that in order to be fulfilled as a Jew, one must move to the land of Israel, or after 1948, the state of Israel. But at the same time, non-Zionism, according to the American Jewish Committee, meant that one could and should support the efforts of the state of Israel, in the vein of that second half of the Columbus platform that we talked about. This is good for Jews of a different sort, not us necessarily, but for other Jews, and we will support it. And that was the basis of the agreement between Ben-Gurion and Blaustein, which basically affirmed the importance of the newly created state of Israel on one hand, and the fact that Jews in the United States owe their political allegiance solely and exclusively to the United States. It was also said that it was not the aspiration of the state of Israel to encourage the immigration of Jews the world over to Israel. And it's kind of remarkable that Ben-Gurion agreed to that in this memorandum. Shortly thereafter, he made clear that that wasn't his real position, and he actually did believe that Jews throughout the world should make their way to the state of Israel. But we see this attempt on the part of American Jewish leaders to in a certain sense, thread a needle between the emerging significance and rise of Zionism, given new reality by the creation of the State of Israel, and their ongoing commitment to Americanism. And one of the ways in which Jews manifest their Americanness was to engage in the work of what Tocqueville famously referred to, the culture of voluntary associations in the United States, creating something that stood between the individual and the state. And indeed, we see that development throughout the 20th century, and that kind of dizzying alphabet soup of Jewish organizations. In the period we're talking about, we see the beginning of two very important organizations, organizations that will become important, weren't necessarily so important in the 1950s, that kind of captured that balancing act between Americanism and Zionism. The first is an organization that would come to be known as AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, whose founding presence was a Jewish communal official by the name of Cy Kennan, pictured on the left, created in its first iteration in 1952. And the second was an organization that served as an umbrella of all sorts of different Jewish groups called the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, founded in 1955, both of which would become very powerful advocates for the State of Israel in the United States. Very powerful, I would say, in the depth of their Zionist commitments, quite unlike the American Jewish Committee, which at that time defined itself as non-Zionist, though one revealing feature of or trend line in American Jewish life is to see what the path is that the American Jewish Committee has followed from its erstwhile non-Zionism to a position of, I would say, very fervent Zionism, very deep commitment to the State of Israel. So we see kind of, on one hand, a very strong impulse of Jews, American Jews in the 1950s, to integrate into American society. By the way, consistent with the movement of Jews from major urban centers to the suburbs. At the same time, we see a new organizational foundation for American Jewish support for Israel taking rise in the same period, and significantly, a realignment, a new alignment of American and Israeli political interest. It's important to note that, notwithstanding the fact that the United States, together with the Soviet Union, voted in favor of the partition of Palestine into two states, the United States was not the leading defender, or for that matter, military supplier of Israel throughout the 1950s. Other countries, including the Czechoslovakia, and France, were very significant military allies of the United States. And only gradually in the late 50s, early 60s, did the United States assume its position as a leading political and military ally of the United States, of Israel. So again, this period is marked by sort of the parallel trends of Americanism, the ongoing Americanization of Jews in the United States, and the growing institutionalization of support for Israel amongst American Jews. And this leads us to the third of our fourth phases that I'd like to discuss, and that phase marked by the Six-Day War in 1967, what I've called the Age of Elation, because that event, the triumph of Israel in the Six-Day War, especially on the heels of a very profound fear that Arab armies would overwhelm Israel and push Jews into the sea. That fear was quite visceral and palpable in the months leading up to June 5th, 1967. It was a fear felt not just by Jews in Israel, but by Jews outside of Israel, who were following with a daily urgency the decisions by Egyptian leader Nasser to pull to close the Suez Canal, and to ask that or demand that United Nations emergency forces be pulled out of the Sinai Desert. Two ominous signals. And so Israel's triumph in the Six-Day War was a moment not just of great relief, but of catharsis, a sense of liberation from what seemed to be almost certain defeat. And it unleashed a new ethos of ethnic pride for Jews the world over. I don't know how many of you remember that moment. Do you remember that kind of unleashing of ethnic pride and relief and catharsis and pride? And it's interesting to note that that sense of pride coincided with a very significant development in the United States amongst other ethnic and racial groups. That very moment marked, in a certain sense, the transition in the African-American community from the integrationist ethos of the civil rights movement to the Black Power, Black Pride movement. And so we see that ethnic pride movements are kind of burgeoning in this very period, just as Israel secures its victory in the Six-Day War. And this leads to a new kind of unvarnished, unapologetic commitment to Zionism on Jews, amongst Jews the world over, including those who might previously had defined themselves as non-Zionists. This was a moment at which the non-Zionist became a Zionist. You would think 1948 would be such a moment, and it was for some, but not all. 1967 is another moment at which this sort of shedding of a measure of ambivalence about one's commitment to the proposition of Zionism reaches a further state of development. And there's elation, there's ecstasy, there's a sense of divine intervention, that God has somehow intervened to save the Jews of Israel. And at the same time, there's now new territory that Israel comes to control, which it turns out is populated largely by Palestinians. It's in the wake of this that we begin to see the first movements towards what becomes known as the settler movement in Israel. The most famous initial iteration of which is an organization or group called Gush Emunim, Block of the Faithful, which begins in 1973, sees this newly conquered territory as, in some sense, a fulfillment of God's plan for the Jewish people, and thus regards the territory as ripe for settlement in realization of God's ultimate plan. This is one of the consequences of the Six-Day War. Another way to phrase this is it's the beginning of Israel's occupation of these conquered territories, according to most, but not all, experts in international law. So just as we see this new spirit of elation, we see also a new intensification of the commitment to hold on to the territory that was conquered. It should be noted that David Ben-Gurion, who at that point was an old man living out his last years at his modest desert home at Sde Boker, Kibbutz Sde Boker, said in the weeks after Israel's conquest, this territory should be returned as part of a peace plan. This was Ben-Gurion's very clear sense, lest it become an albatross around our necks. I'm not sure if that's some measure of disagreement with that proposition. But not everybody agreed with Ben-Gurion, and certainly not the religious Zionists of Gush Emunim. In the same time, in the same period, we see an intensification of global scrutiny of Israel's actions and the development of a kind of new formulation, especially emerging out of the Arab world, which is that Zionism itself is equivalent to racism. That was the essence of a resolution passed by the United Nations in 1975. And it's important to ask, what is the impact of that? Well, one of the consequences of that kind of movement to define Zionism as racism was a new effort by American Jewish activists to describe anti-Zionism as a new form of anti-Semitism. So that formulation of anti-Zionism is equivalent to or very closely connected to anti-Semitism, is not a product of recent years. It actually goes back to a book published by two activists associated with the American Jewish community called The New Anti-Semitism, and was focused particularly on this. So we should just be mindful of the historical roots of that association. So again, we're in a period in which there's still this sense of elation amongst American Jews over Israel's victory. And yet at the same time, well, not at the same time, but in concert with that, there's new concern over Israel's well-being, given what occurs on October 6, 1973, which is the Egyptian and Syrian invasion of Israel on Yom Kippur. This was the Yom Kippur War, and it deepened that sense of fear on the part of world Jews about what was going on in Israel, as well as a sense of connection. And the October 6 Yom Kippur War also prompted the two major players in that conflict, namely Israel and Egypt, to ask themselves, might there be an alternative path to eternal war? And there were years of reflection over that question, which ultimately led to the first major Camp David agreement, which was enshrined in a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. I'm just wondering how many people here remember when Anwar Sadat descended the steps of his airplane in Israel for the first time. Yeah, a memorable moment. The peace treaty that was engineered quite skillfully by US President Jimmy Carter, recently departed, again, lent to American Jews a sense of the possibility of Israel living at peace with its neighbors, and had the effect of fortifying a sense that not only was possible, but it was necessary to support Israel. It was necessary to support Israel in times of challenge, and it was necessary to support Israel in times of great opportunity. So I would suggest to you that over the course of that decade, from 67 to 78, 79, we have, again, a further consolidation of an American Jewish commitment to the Zionist project as reflected in the State of Israel. But Jews being Jews, that didn't assure unanimity of perspective. And in 1973, we see the emergence of a group of Jewish intellectuals, rabbis in the United States called Brera, which means choice or alternative, which sought to promote the idea that it was a moral and political obligation for Israel to engage in direct talks with Palestinians and ultimately to grant Palestinians, to enable Palestinians to achieve self-determination in the form of two states. We can talk about the history of the two-state solution, but this is one early formulation of it, in a certain sense, before its time, before mainstream American Jewish organizations had moved to embrace that position. And this is an indication that there was not unanimity within the American Jewish community, as I would suggest to you, there never really has been. And not only that, but over the course of the next decade or so, we see cracks beginning to emerge, especially a decade later. So we have on one hand, the renewed happiness over the Israel-Egypt peace treaty, but 4 years after that, we have what is regarded as the first war that Israel entered that was not based on a national consensus. And that was Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which commenced what most would regard as a disastrous 18-year engagement in Lebanon. This is important for us because the Lebanon War, and particularly the aftermath of the massacre of Palestinians by Christian Phalangerist forces in the refugee camp Sabra and Shatila on 16 to 18 September 1982, led to a new kind of introspection on the part of American Jews, who really for the first time, those who had sort of defined themselves as Zionists over the last several decades began to ask themselves if the policies of the State of Israel were aligned with their values. And we see here in this quote by American Jewish author Mark Halperin, an indication that sort of the prior agreement by which Jews in America would be quite silent in their, well, in holding back criticism of the State of Israel would no longer be the case. Lebanon, in some sense, broke that inhibition or taboo to express criticism of Israel openly. And so you might say that this is a process of maturation of the relationship of American Jews to Israel. 67 was a kind of naive adolescent sense of elation, and this is perhaps a more mature sense of the relationship that we can have to critique publicly. That's one way to imagine this. What we can say is that the Lebanon War turned out to be an enormously controversial undertaking in Israel itself. About a week after Sabra and Shatila, the massacre at Sabra and Shatila took place, the largest demonstration in Israeli history took place. 400,000 Israelis, a tenth of the population, gathered to protest Israel's war in Lebanon and its enabling of the Phalangerist forces to have their way in Beirut. I happened to be at that demonstration. I was in my first year of graduate school at Tel Aviv, and it was an absolutely unforgettable experience. As we move forward in time, we see that developments in Israel and diplomatic initiatives kind of have the effect of reinforcing a sense of the commitment to an Israel that itself was on a path toward peace. That is to say, there was a commitment to an Israel that saw its way in the region and the world as not just engaging in armed conflict, but as doubling its resolve to a path of peace. And here I would say the key reflection of that impulse was after the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987, in what is in some sense the greatest diplomatic moment after the first Camp David treaty, which was the Oslo peace process in the mid-1990s. This was, I would say, the height of the belief that Israel might live in a region and an era of peace for years or decades to come. I remember feeling when I saw President Clinton sort of force together Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, that we might live to see the day in which Jews and Palestinians live in peace. It was an extraordinarily powerful moment, especially since it came after the first Intifada, which was an uprising, largely initially an uprising of civil disobedience against Israeli control of the West Bank. Coming off of the first Intifada, it seemed like indeed the arc of history might be bending towards justice. That hope was dashed very considerably by the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in early November 1995. He, as you may recall, was replaced as prime minister not by his close ally, Shimon Peres, who was expected to win election easily after Rabin's death, but rather by a rising star within the Likud party, a man by the name of Benjamin Netanyahu. Was first elected prime minister in 1996 to succeed Rabin. And over the half a decade after Rabin's assassination, the Oslo process sort of lost its momentum and ultimately yielded to the second Palestinian uprising of the year 2000, which was far more violent than the first, and elicited a far more violent Israeli response, and led many in Israel and in the Jewish community around the world to say, we had deluded ourselves into believing that we could make peace with the Arab world, and now we see the true face of our enemy. It was a moment of reckoning for many Jews who came to believe that the path of peace was not likely to be realized in their lifetime. And this brings us to the final phase that I want to talk about, the phase of called fragmentation. What we saw prior to this point was really, I'd say, an emerging path toward consensus amongst American Jews towards Israel, with very significant moments of resistance to that consolidation, or very important moments of critique of the American Jewish relationship to Israel, particularly critique of the impulse to resist any public criticism of the Israeli government, as we saw reflected in Breira and in reactions to the Lebanon war. The period we're about to talk about begins at the end of the Second Intifada, 2005, which is the year in which then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon agreed to withdraw unilaterally Israeli settlers, about just under 8,000, from the Gaza Strip. It's interesting to take note of where Jews in the United States were in their thinking about Israel in that period after 2005. So here, I'll give you some statistics from a very important poll or survey undertaken by the Pew Research Center 8 years after that, in 2013, which revealed that about 7 in 10 Jews in America say they were emotionally very attached or somewhat attached to Israel. That year is important because it's a good indication of where things were in the kind of post-Oslo era. And yet the next year, 2014, was a very significant one because it marked an intensification of the conflict between Israel and the entity that had taken control of Gaza after Israel's withdrawal, Hamas. Israel felt that it had both the right and ability to handle the threat posed by Hamas, whose charter called for the elimination of Jews from Palestine, by undertaking operations that it called mowing the grass, sort of degrading the capacity of Hamas when it was felt necessary to do so. And after the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, every 2 years or so, such an operation was undertaken, often in response to Hamas firing rockets into Israel proper, which then prompted a very significant Israeli response. And the Israeli response in 2014 was a much greater scale than those that had taken place before. I'm going to explain a bit more why later. But one interesting development that occurred And here we get to the generational question with which I'll conclude my remarks. One interesting development was in the wake of Israel's military campaign in Gaza, a new organization of younger Jews took rise by the name of If Not Now. And If Not Now adopted an organizational strategy that drew on Jewish ritual tradition, but with a very interesting twist. It gained renown initially in the summer of 2014 by appearing in front of mainstream Jewish organizations or the Israeli consulate and saying the mourner's prayer, the Kaddish, for all victims of the conflict, Israeli Jews and Palestinians. And it stated that it was no longer going to accept the sort of consensual position of reticence or reservation or silence in the face of what it thought was misguided Israeli policy. If Not Now was comprised of younger Jews, Jews in their 1920s, quite distinct from the cohort of Jews that populated other progressive Jewish organizations like Americans for Peace Now, J Street, or Brit Tzedek V'Shalom, an organization that no longer exists. This, I think, reflects an important generational development, that what had emerged as a kind of consensual view within the organized Jewish community was now going to be challenged. And was not going to be challenged only on ideological grounds, but on generational grounds as well. And that process of challenge, I think, was amplified and moved forward by the whiteward drift that was noticeable in Israel, not so much in the first tenure of Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister from 1996 to 1999, but his second tenure, beginning in 2009 and essentially lasting until today, with 1 year as an exception. That rightward drift, when Netanyahu took power a second time, with, I think, a real commitment and plan to transform Israel into a very serious conservative state. Perhaps the most important legislative exemplar of that was the nation-state law of 2018, which declared that the state of Israel was the national homeland exclusively of Jews, and Jewish settlement should be given priority to the exclusion of others. The word democracy is not mentioned in this nation-state law. The rights of the large Arab minority is not mentioned, are not mentioned in this law. And it seemed to really reflect a significant rightward drift of the Israeli polity, which gained additional momentum after the elections of November 1st, 2022, when Benjamin Netanyahu, in order to remain in power, actually to return to power after a year in which he was out, joined forces with two far-right parties that were conjoined into one under the heading Tzionut Hadatit, religious Zionism, whose leaders were on the left, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who had been until recently the Minister of National Security, and on the right, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister. Why do I mention this development, which takes us away from America to Israel? Because it had, I think, a very important effect, the rightward drift, upon differing generations of Jews in the United States. If you can see here, the Pew study from 2020 shows that 67% of Jews over the age of 65 feel themselves very or somewhat attached to Israel, whereas only 48% of Jews between 18 and 29 feel that way. So we can see over the course of less than a decade a shift in the attitudes of younger Jews towards Israel that I think is given a very significant push forward by 2014. What happens in the wake of October 7th in terms of this emerging political, cultural, and generational divide? Well, I think it's very interesting to see how differing generations of Jews responded or felt about President Joe Biden's policies towards Israel. You see on the penultimate line, the line before the last, that actually this is, I should be very careful noting, this is not a poll or a survey of Jews. This is a survey of Americans in general, but I think it reflects the generational divisions that would be emerging, that have been emerging over the last decade or so. When asked, do you approve of the way Biden is handling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I believe this was December 2023, 52% of Americans over 65 said yes. 72% of Americans between 18 and 29 said no. So there are emerging differences, not just amongst Jews in America over the relationship to Israel, but Americans generally, according to generational lines. October 7th also poses the question for us, not just of this potential rift between generations, but rather whether we have entered a new era in the long history of anti-Semitism. And if posed these questions, many Jews will answer quite clearly yes. So 77% of American Jews, according to a recent survey by the American Jewish Committee, said they feel less safe after October 7th. They're not exactly sure where the threat comes from, or I should say there's no consensus about where the threat comes from. There's kind of an equal percentage who believe that it comes from Islamic extremism, from Christian nationalism, from the extreme left, and from the extreme right. And there are other studies that I'd be happy to discuss with you that argue that anti-Semitism is chiefly to be found on the right, and some that show that or argue that it's primarily found amongst the left. To bring things closer to home here, 35% of Jewish college students report experiencing anti-Semitism, but the final data point that I'll mention is something of a revelation to us and a reminder that Jews sometimes dwell in a bubble because 41% of young Americans aren't even familiar with the term anti-Semitism. And one of the principal questions that the post-October 7th world has put on the table is the question of whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. And on this point, I would say there is very significant division, including within the generation of young people. So Tim's question about what the impact of October 7th has been on younger Jews, would it push Jews further away from a commitment to Israel and fortify their commitment to Israel? The response is yes. Both developments have occurred. I think we see that there are between pro-Jewish groups or individuals really across the country. As you can see in the pictures here, where on the left you see a pro-Israel rally at my home institution, UCLA, and on the right, a pro-Palestine protest or demonstration populated by Jews, amongst others. What's particularly interesting, and I'm going to wrap up in just a minute, is that this division within a generation has also occurred on the Jewish left. One very interesting indication of this is the recent book by a young Jewish intellectual by the name of Joshua Leifer, who had been one of the most important Israel correspondents for the left and often anti-Zionist magazine Jewish Currents, who after October 7th felt that he had to part ways with his erstwhile colleagues on the left because of their lack of condemnation of October 7th. And Josh Leifer wrote up the account of his disappointment, both with the course of American Jewish history and with his erstwhile allies on the left in a book called Tablets Shattered, which I think is a very interesting reflection or mirror onto the divisions within the Jewish left in the United States. The question that we have to confront now, and which is of real significance in thinking about American Jewish attitudes towards Israel, is what does anti-Semitism in today's world look like in the Trump era, in an era dominated by such a dominant political figure as Donald Trump. And there are multiple questions about where anti-Semitism might emanate from. Might it emanate, as we saw in the American Jewish Committee poll, from the radical left? Might it emanate from the emerging far right in this country? And I think we have to ask ourselves the question, and what role does Israel and what role does Israeli action play in fostering increasing enmity towards Israel and, by extension, Jews? So these are questions that I want to leave you with, but I'm going to conclude by offering these propositions. First, we exist in a time of tremendous division and uncertainty across political, denominational, and generational boundaries. What I've tried to suggest to you is the division around Zionism or Israel is not new for Jews, because in every period that we've surveyed, there has been profound ideological difference. I think there's no doubt that these differences have increased in the age of media, and particularly social media, which is such a force multiplier, as we talked about earlier today, of radical thinking. And I'm afraid to say that divisions are not likely to decrease in the current political moment. So we're likely to see further fractures within, between generations and within generations. But I do hold to the view that Jews are an ever-dying people, in the sense that, again, we believe we might be the last link in the chain. And yet I have a good deal of confidence in the resilience of Jews to weather divergence and controversy. And I think that is really premised on what is a question, but I'll make it into a statement: our ability to learn to live with and talk across difference. And if we are to do so, it will require humility in understanding that we don't know everything, real sincere listening to the views of others with whom we might not agree, concomitantly open-mindedness and empathy, mindful of the fact that difference has really been a hallmark of the modern Jewish experience, and indeed of American Jewish attitudes towards Zionism and Israel. Thank you very much.
Well,
Sure.
we'll now take questions, and I have a microphone, not just for the people in this room to hear better, but we have about 100 people online on Zoom that also have some questions. Want to start us off? Well,
Can I
you
ask it?
get to-
David first. David, thank you for your brilliant and comprehensive tour through the history of American attitudes to Zionism. I thought I knew a lot. I learned a lot, and I thank you for that. I want to go to your second to last bullet point. Can we learn to tolerate, live with, and talk across differences? Do you think your colleagues at UCLA and at other universities are capable of living with and talking across differences when it comes to American attitude, when it comes to Israel, the existence of Israel, and the whether Israel has a place in the Council of Nations?
It's a really good question. I hope so, because I'm the director of our Dialogue Across Difference initiative at UCLA. So I'm very much invested in believing that that we can indeed find new ways. I think that there are definitely colleagues who are so deeply entrenched that they're not interested in, sort of moving an iota from their established positions. And they're not the ones to whom we're making a play. I believe that there is a large percentage of members of our UCLA community, including faculty, whose voices we don't hear, who are indeed capable of nuance, who find themselves in a state of perplexity about the situation on the ground, which is terrible. And, in so many ways, October 7th is terrible. The devastation in Gaza is terrible. The condition of the hostages is terrible. The condition of children in Gaza is terrible. Like, that requires holding on to competing sensibilities. And we're not very good at that in America in general. So as I said this morning, we've become at the university reflections of that highly polarized state of American political culture. And I think it's a larger challenge. But to go back to your question, I think there are a lot of people whom we're not hearing from, who are anxious, desperate for nuance and complexity. And we haven't yet sort of made clear to them that it's okay to be possessed of multiple sensibilities, to believe that this can be terrible and that can be terrible. I have to believe that that we will be able to recapture that muscle to talk across difference, because if we don't, and I don't want to sound apocalyptic, the university as we know it will cease to exist. The stakes are no more or less than that. So we damn well better try.
Reflection of the overall. Some people believe that the leaders of the overall students reflect that.
Yeah, I think the polarization that we see on the university is really a reflection of a much more powerful force, which is just American political culture, which is driven to extremes by the fragmented media world or landscape that we inhabit. And my view is we've become less generators of different and new models of how to interact with one another, and mirrors of what's going on in American society. So, I think, Tucker Carlson or Steve Bannon or Joe Rogan are exponentially more powerful formulators of attitudes than any single one of my colleagues or any 10 of them together. So that's sort of as I said, the vector of activity that I think we need to reverse. We need to become leaders, but we need to do so by overcoming that polarization, that toxic polarization, and adding nuance and complexity. If we don't do that, then we're good for nothing.
David, there's more water under on the shelf in there and
Got it.
behind you.
Thank you. My question deals with students. I have two sons, went to school in California. We're both Reformed Jews, fifth generation American Jews, neutral on Israel, neutral on any of anti-Semitism. And in college, one was at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, one was in California College of the Arts in San Francisco, in Oakland, and were indoctrinated against Israel by teachers. And that is, I've heard from many people who have children at the universities that the professors, even if it isn't a history class, a mathematics class, an arts class, an engineering class, are espousing anti-Israel and anti-Jewish sentiments. So what is being done at the universities? And from your perspective, can anything be done?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the case that there are faculty at many institutions across the United States who hold to anti-Zionist and anti-Israel attitudes. There are, as we've seen, many Jews over the course of the last century who held to anti-Zionist sensibilities. I am of the belief that, again, I'll repeat what I said in response to the first question. I think we have to combat a lack of subtlety and nuance with subtlety and nuance. That's what we do at the university. I have the unique benefit of being kind of reviled by both extremes. Regarded as a traitor, I'm from one group and a collaborator from the other.
We got both of those complaints, so
Yeah.
you're right.
Sure.
That's great.
It's not the first time, Lisa, trust me. I think there's a place that I think of as the sane center, not in political terms, but sort of in relational terms, where I want to be and I want to sort of make clear to others that there's room to land. But what I will say is the university is, when it works, an open marketplace of ideas. Students should come to confront ideas with which they're profoundly uncomfortable. That's part of the work of intellectual maturation. If we're not doing that, we're doing them no service. What we don't want to encourage is a culture of conformity, where you're told this is the way you must think. I want robust debate and I want dialogue. And what dialogue means is not, wonderful harmony on everything. It means let's figure out how to talk and disagree in ways that don't stigmatize or essentialize or vilify the other. So that's my response. I mean, we have to get back to or create anew the conditions in which that kind of open marketplace of ideas can take place, and just say, we're not here to indoctrinate students to think this way or that way. We're here to expose them to challenging ideas. And as I said, I'm not coming to you with boundless optimism about our chances. I'm coming to you and saying, we better attend to the problem before it's too late.
So thank you. This is absolutely fascinating. My question is going to a completely different direction. So you've been talking largely about the world of academia and people who are looking for nuance, looking for bringing forth ideas. But the bulk of Jews in American society are not in academia, or they're not heavily engaged. Of the 100,000 odd Jews in the greater Phoenix area, fewer than 10,000 are very involved in the Jewish community, probably more like 6,000. However, in my experience growing up, the bulk of Jews, at least those who were somewhat engaged, but not very engaged, were very pro-Israel. They're very enthusiastic. They were rah-rah after the Six-Day War and after the Yom Kippur War and so on. Has that changed? How are we doing in terms of what are Jews in general in America thinking about Israel outside the walls of academia?
Yeah, well, we have some data on that. There are surveys undertaken by the Anti-Defamation League and particularly the American Jewish Committee in its annual political attitudes report, which I invite you to take a look at. Jews overall in the United States are still possess overwhelmingly favorable attitudes towards Israel. And yet, it's also the case that younger Jews, who, even those who profess favorable attitudes to Israel, are increasingly willing to be open about their criticism of policies with which they disagree. There's something that, if not now, said and promoted that I think is important to bear in mind, which is Jewish educational institutions, I think, made a mistake. As I say that as a parent who sent his 3 daughters through every imaginable form of a Jewish educational institution, in not offering nuance and complexity when it came to Israel, in offering a kind of vision of Israel as a place of unblemished moral virtue, such that when kids got to college campuses and they heard the notion or the idea of an occupation, they didn't know what anyone was talking about. And then that sort of became apartheid. And I don't feel we gave our kids the kinds of analytical tools to engage in a conversation when they made their way to college campuses. And I guess I'm answering your question indirectly by saying, and this is kind of counterintuitive to any effective marketing strategy known to humanity, but nuance and complexity, it seems to me, are what will serve to engage younger generations of Jews more than kind of a kind of mythologized Exodus era image of Israel as this place of kind of mythic virtue. It's a real place, right? It's got many flaws. It's got many virtues. Be real. So this, I think, has got to be incorporated into the educational philosophy of the Jewish community moving forward. And it's going to be really hard to do that after October 7th. It's going to be really hard to do that. But I don't know that there's any other way in order to, I mean, I'm thinking of, not with all due respect, people of my generation, but really the future of the community, such that they not be the last link in the chain. And there, I think we need to be more real than we are.
Okay, so I'm going to take some of the questions that are online now. And I'm going to combine a couple. So one is people are interested in seeing the generational differences. Do the generational differences that you talked about in the US, how do they relate in Israel? And along those same lines, I'm wondering if we're judging people at a time in their life, especially young people, where their brains are not fully developed yet. So is part of that change in attachment something that comes with maturity and the ability to see nuance differently than when you see it at 18?
I turn to the Ecksteins and say, where is Paul Bentheim when you need him about sort of the maturity of the brain? Israel. So there's this kind of striking phenomenon in Israel, which is true in very few countries in the world. And that is that younger Israelis are more right-wing than their parents. It's also the case that rates of racism are higher amongst younger Israelis than older Israelis. So that's quite different from the American Jewish profile. And I think it suggests the possibility of increasing divergence between American Jews and Israeli Jews. And that's something I think we need to pay attention to. I'm a big advocate of people-to-people contact as a strategy for deepening the bond between Jews the world over. And I think that's a way to overcome all sorts of differences by sort of humanizing one another. Certainly what Israeli Jews and Palestinians should be doing, sort of overcoming the towering psychological and political walls that separate them, prevent them from seeing the humanity of the other. And I think we need to do that for Jews in the United States, younger Jews in the United States, and Jews, and for that matter, Arabs in Israel. Okay, and remind me, Lisa, of your second question.
Generation here and then maturity.
Oh, maturity. Is it a function of maturity? In sort of the reverse of what I just described, I think it is the case that people become more conventional and establishment in their perspective over time. And that may mean that they will settle into or close to the communal consensus. On the other hand, I don't think that sort of the moral questioning that's taking place amongst younger Jews is going to disappear anytime soon. I think that Gaza opened up a huge Pandora's box. And I think it's going to be very hard to put back into it that picture that many younger Jews received in their formative education. So I think, we, again, have to think of alternative educational strategies and different ways of reaching people without assuming that they'll kind of time out of their kind of juvenile sensibilities.
I too very much enjoyed your march through Jewish and the Middle Eastern history. As I look at this last slide, I interpret it on the micro level that it involves Jews, pro-Israeli Jews and anti-Israeli Jews, as well as pro-Israeli Jews and anti-Israeli non-Jews. That's all fine and dandy. But when the leaders of the world are still talking about a two-state solution as the only avenue toward peace, don't we need enlightened leaders from both Israel and the Palestinian side to make that happen? And if we can't get those leaders, can we ever hope to have a two-state solution? And the final question is a two-state solution the only avenue for permanent peace in the Middle East?
That's all you would like to know.
That's not.
That's all you'd like to know. I for a long time held to the view that the two-state solution, as Churchill said of democracy, was the worst solution there was, except for all of the others. And then I thought it's been rendered impossible by the erasure of the Green Line by the settlers movement, which has populated the West Bank in ways that would make it very difficult to withdraw. And thus, I had concluded for many years, sad, happy, doesn't make any difference. We're deluding ourselves if we think the two-state solution can be realized. October 7th has kind of changed that for me, insofar as it seems more utopian and impossible to imagine a single state in which Jews and Palestinians will reside harmoniously anytime soon. So we retreat back to the two-state idea, and still there are very vexing challenges to imagine it being implemented or realized. I'm particularly interested in a variation of the theme, which is the idea of a confederation, which consists of two states with an open border. It has the benefit of the requisite separation that I think Jews and Palestinians need after October 7th, and the requisite criterion of integration, which is certainly necessary for the economic sustainability of any Palestinian state. It also helps answer the question of what do you do with the settlers? Because an open border would allow settlers to remain in a state of Palestine, should they choose to do so peaceably, as Israeli citizens. It also would allow Palestinians the right of movement, the right of free movement. Highly imperfect, but it begins to address what I think is the most difficult, gnawing problem of the two-state solution, which is what do you do with 750,000 Israelis who are smack in the middle of the West Bank?
I think we're gonna give John the last word here and.
I'm going to send you my modest proposal that I wrote in November of 2023. And basically it says, and I anticipated the total destruction of Gaza, which has occurred, and that it won't be livable again for a good at least 10 years. If peace is ever going to occur, as in most solutions, there have to be compromises. The Palestinian compromise is to cede Gaza to Israel. The major Israeli compromise is to force or have the settlers voluntarily leave the West Bank and come back to Israel or go to Gaza and build their world-class resort there. Now, everyone has laughed at me that could never happen. What else has been done over the past 75 years that has ever been successful?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think we're going to be able to answer it fully. I respectfully disagree with your proposal insofar as I think a people that has been displaced once to places including Gaza should not be displaced again on a permanent basis. I mean, there is work of reconstruction that needs to be done. But what I will say is that we are in desperate need of new political imagination. So in that regard, I welcome all new ideas, such that we can sort of begin to move beyond the place of paralysis where we find ourselves. I don't think it may well be that we need that political imagination as much as we need sort of the new leaders to drop out of heaven. We need to sort of think about ways that match realism and the need for justice, in new and innovative ways. And I guess I would just conclude by saying, in my sense of sort of the grand swings of history, the pendulum has to now push towards the side pole of justice for Palestinians. Israel has essentially secured self-determination for the Jewish people. The next important move must be, both for tactical and for principled reasons, some meaningful form of self-determination for Palestinians. So maybe your proposal will get us there, maybe it won't, but I'd say the more the merrier in terms of new ideas.
Doesn't know where the displaced Palestinians are going to go. They're going to go somewhere. My proposal is to move the 2 million Gazan Palestinians to the West Bank to join their 2 million brethren there with the settlers gone. And that will be the one Arab state, one Palestinian state. Okay. Not a divided state with Gaza and the West Bank.
I look forward to reading it.
Well, before I turn it over to Hava, I just also want to acknowledge Valley Beit Midrash, one of our community partners who helped tonight happen as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Hava to conclude us.
I think we are saving for giving us a very inspiring and informative and thoughtful way of reading. I'm sorry. I would like to, on behalf of all of us, to thank Professor Myers for a very inspiring and informative and thoughtful approach to very complex set of issues. Nobody had solutions. Nobody really knows what needs to be done. I'm sorry, John. I really think that we are in a conundrum, but at least you showed us how to approach it. At least in academic settings, we can try to do that. And actually, I'm a great believer in just teaching the history of the conflict, because most people, including the United States, faculty and students, simply don't know the history. So we try to do it in a program November 9th at ASU, but we really need to start from basics. A lot of the protests and a lot of that energy is based on very little knowledge. So let's give them the knowledge, and let's all of us continue to think through very complex set of issues. So thank you for coming. Thank you for being online with us, and join us.